Thank you. So we're ready to proceed. Mr. Kushner, just for information and find out, everybody got me?
Yes, sir.
Where we're going from here. This is your witness, last witness for this session. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. This is final witness.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
This is the, sorry. This is the final witness as part of the city's case in chief for this phase of the hearing, Ms. Anderson. She will be in chief certainly for the morning. My hope is that we'll be able to complete her evidence in chief by the lunch break and then continue with her cross-examination this afternoon.
Thank you. Okay.
So just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping matters. Firstly, you'll recall at the end of the day yesterday, there was some insinuations made by my friend, Mr. Streisfield, which in my submission unfairly cast aspersions on the professional integrity of a member of the city's urban design staff. I can advise the tribunal that the individual in question continued on medical leave under doctor's orders until July 6th. She was cleared to return to work on July 7th, and that's the day that she participated in the Heritage Richmond Hill matter that you heard about. I just wanted to bring that to the tribunal's attention. I have the documentation if needed, but I thought it was important to clear the individual's professional integrity and reputation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
We do have some additional handouts that Mr. Kahar will be providing. The first are the proposed modifications to the secondary plan and Part 1 official plan that arise from the settlement between the city and TSMJC. And we circulated these to all of the parties prior to the commencement of the hearing yesterday. Ms. Anderson had prepared consolidated versions of all of those. So you have in two handouts, one for the Part 1 OP and one for the secondary plan, all of the policies that are the subject of that settlement, which also includes some other parties in some instances.
Mr. Kushner, I'm not sure I understood your last phrase. You said, and also includes.
Oh, I might have caused confusion unnecessarily. My point was simply that, as you'll hear when we get to them, in some instances, the modifications that you see on those documents are also settled as among other parties. They include, for example, the policies dealing with the bus terminal.
So, Mr. Chair, we're at Exhibit 34, and I propose the Part 1 modifications be identified as Exhibit 34. The secondary plan modifications, which is the second document that we handed up to, larger 35. Thank you.
So 34 and 35 respectively. Okay, good.
Sorry. We also have the redacted versions of Ms. Anderson's two witness statements. They've been redacted in the same format as all of the city's other witness statements. So with your permission, we'd like to file them as exhibits as well.
So I guess the redacted witness statement would be 36.
Thank you, sir.
And 37 for the reply redacted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just by way of clarification, I understand that, first of all, with respect to exhibits 34 and 35, obviously, they're being marked now, but obviously they're to be spoken to, obviously. And with respect to exhibit 35 and 36, as of this point in time, North Elgin's position is we do not accept the redactions as proposed by the city. So let's be clear. These are just your redactions. I haven't accepted that they are proper redactions.
Well, let's proceed. Mr. Kressner. Go.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Ms. Anderson. I know it's been a while ago now, but you have been sworn.
Yes.
And I know you've been waiting very patiently for the past few days. Can you confirm, have you participated or attended the hearing for the examination in chief and cross-examination of all of the city witnesses who have preceded you to date?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So with that, perhaps you could assist the tribunal and provide a roadmap of the evidence you intend to give this morning.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kustner. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. What I'd like to do for the assistance of the members is to provide an overview of the land use planning evidence that I intend to provide the members. And I've set that out to ensure that it's efficient and not repeating or going through some of the introductory information I provided, but I certainly can highlight any of those points where it may be necessary. In my presentation, I want to provide a very brief overview. In my introductory presentation, excuse me, I did provide an overview of the physical context of the area, describing the quadrants, also describing the current landowners, the various appeals, and the application status of some of those matters related to appeal and others that are ongoing. And also a chronology of the planning process that has led to the proposed modifications that are before you. I also provided the members with a very high-level overview of the land use policy framework and the regulatory framework that is required to be considered with respect to the proposed modifications. And that relates to matters that are required to be consistent with, implement, and to conform to in relation to provincial policy, regional policy, and the local policy. I also went through the structure and the elements of both the secondary plan, its schedules, as well as the proposed zoning, implementing zoning bylaw, its regulations, as well as the Part 1 official plan policy amendments that are proposed. So again, I'm not going to repeat that. I may bring up certain references to that information. But I will focus my attention on providing the members with my land use planning expert opinion on the appropriateness and the justification of the proposed policies and regulations in that broader land use policy context. And so my evidence will cover, starting with the Part 1 official plan policy proposed amendments, and you will note this morning that filed with you were some further proposed amendments to wording for those matters that are before you that remain under appeal in the Part 1 plan. And I will be providing the members with my overview of those modifications, as well as my opinion on those further recommendations. And many of those, as you will note, have arisen as a result of settlement discussions and the resolution of issues, specifically with the party TSMJC. I will also be responding through my evidence as I present it to you to some of the specific issues that were raised in relation to a particular policy or a particular regulation. And I've done that in a way that it integrates with the flow of my evidence. So I won't go through evidence and get to the end and then go through the issues. I'm going to integrate those to try and be more efficient. And certainly, most importantly, I will be providing you with my professional opinion in relation to the policy context and how both the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw and the Part 1 amendment, proposed amendment policies conform to and are consistent with provincial policy and conform with regional and local policy. And finally, I will summarize for you, based on the proposed modifications, how they represent good planning, are in the public interest, and should be approved by this tribunal. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to start with a very brief recap of the physical context and the process. Only to suggest to you that we've heard a lot about a lot of evidence that's taken you to the 2017 plan that was adopted and the plan that is before you today. And in my introductory evidence, I identified the process that occurred between that period and also identified the changes that occurred with respect to provincial and regional policy. And these were significant policy changes that included, in my opinion, an increased focus on the importance of providing greater emphasis on transit supportive development, transit supportive densities within the major transit station areas and along higher order transit corridors. And as you know, the Yonge Street itself is a higher order transit corridor, priority transit corridor, and the KDA itself is a major transit station area. And so the revisions to the 2017 plan and the subsequent work that was undertaken was focused on addressing those policy changes, as well as the direction of council to address those matters. And those modifications also include consideration that a municipal comprehensive review process, an overview again, an update of both the region's plan and the local plan are also taking place at that time. And so we know that the original official plan, the adopted official plan for the city of Richmond Hill that's before you was actually adopted in 2010 and then has been, was subsequently subject to a number of hearings to result in some settlements, and still there are some outstanding appeals, but basically that plan is in full force and effect with the adoption in 2010. And in my opinion, the changes that have occurred at the provincial and the regional level have all occurred since 2010. And so those changes that have occurred, and now that we are amending that plan, constitute a significant justification for bringing forward these modifications to the KDA before you that have been recommended by the city, that have been subject to public consultation, stakeholder consultation, and were endorsed by City Council. And there have been, no doubt, some very important changes to the 2017 adopted plan and zoning bylaw and the plan that is before you today. But it would be my opinion that there are changes in relation to things that are different and things that are new. And I would say to you, in both cases, many of the elements have remained consistent in relation to the framework and the structure of both documents, the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw. And I mentioned this in my introductory evidence just by way of fact that there are certain principles that remain the same. There are certainly the land use designations or the character areas that have remained consistent. The principles in particular in terms of improving connectivity and providing for a multimodal active transportation network to support the plan has remained intact as a fundamental principle. And the idea of providing for transit supportive densities and an overall density has remained intact. The support, again, the focus on transit supportive and integrated planning is a key theme that has been consistent from the 2017 plan and the plan before you. And one other element that has remained consistent is the approach to the transition to the context. We know that there are neighboring areas that are referred to as neighborhoods in the official plan designation, and the sensitivity with the amount of intensification as it relates to those areas has been maintained in terms of a transition, both in relation to height and density to those surrounding areas. We also know that the existing conditions within the physical area itself have remained consistent, with the exception, as I mentioned, of the construction of the Viva BRT, which is under construction. So there has been no substantial change, again, other than some recent approvals that have occurred with respect to some of the applications that I mentioned. The changes that have occurred, as I mentioned, are different in terms of the approach to addressing height through the deployment of built form policies and implementing zoning regulations and removing a cap on heights. That is different. That is a different approach to the deployment of intensification and development within the secondary plan. And certainly there are changes that are different in relation to the deployment of park space, but certainly not to the detriment of the plan. In fact, the opposite, to the enhancement of the plan, to provide flexibility to incorporate both linear parks as well as urban plazas that can be provided through the redevelopment opportunities as they come forward. And these changes or differences in the way in which development can now occur and be implemented through both the policies and the zoning bylaw also provide for some new policies. And those are to enhance and support the plan in relation to, as I mentioned in my initial evidence, the introduction of the at-grade frontages, the introduction of a requirement to ensure that the existing level of non-residential development, the commercial development, is not eroded and that it's maintained and in fact increased with the redevelopment opportunities as they come forward. So policies and provisions have been put in place to support that principle. And in addition, and importantly, policies and provisions have been put in place to provide for appropriate phasing and the monitoring of development. And that is provided through the holding policies in the implementation section of the plan, as well as the zoning bylaw. And so I would provide the members that these changes are intended to facilitate the densities and heights in a manner that is consistent with the changes, as I had mentioned, in those higher order policy direction documents from both the province and the region, without undermining or significantly altering the plan, role, and function of the KDA as it's provided for both in the Part 1 plan and as it relates to the physical context, including the transition and the interface with those adjacent neighborhoods. You know, I would conclude by saying that the process and the changes and the proposed modifications before you, while considered certainly changes, and some of which may be seen as different and new, and have a level of change that is very much different and new as it relates to those specific items. It's really a change in regards to the approach. And it's my opinion that it's appropriate to modify the plan as it was adopted in 2017 and subsequently appealed with the proposed modifications that are presented to you from the city. And I think this corresponds with the approach and the order that was provided previously by Mr. McCooch, where he talked about the individual and cumulative changes do not have the effect of changing the essential nature or character of the secondary plan. And I believe, again, by providing you that overview with the differences and the added policies, that it's my opinion that is true. So those proposed modifications, as I had provided the members previously, relate to changes to the Part 1 plan, modifications to that plan. And I would note for the members that In dealing with a secondary plan, it's often the case, even with a new secondary plan, whether it's a district plan or in this case, referred to as a KDA plan, it's very common in planning practice to also require adjustments and modifications to the parent official plan. And that is also true with a zoning bylaw, where you may have changes to a comprehensive zoning bylaw that also require some minor adjustments and changes to enable those documents to all work together. And so I'd like to turn now to the proposed modifications to the Part 1 plan. And for my evidence in relation to the Part 1 plan, I will be referring to Exhibit 34. And I will also be referring to the actual policies in the Part 1 plan. And if I could, I think it will be of assistance to the members if I can bring those up on the screen so that as I'm referencing the sections, it may be easier to follow through with the pages I'm referring to. So if you just bear with me, and I'm looking to share my screen. Thank you. So hopefully everyone can see that. So what I've pulled up on the screen is a copy of the
Not
It's a bit delayed. And I believe Mr. Carr confirmed for me that this is tab. I believe it's tab, I know it's volume 3 and I believe it's tab 8. No?
not yet.
Is it there yet? Okay. Okay. Ms. Foran will be very proud of me. So, Mr. Chairman, before I go into the details of the proposed modification and also just an overview of the Part 1 plan, I'd like to take the members through a number of sections of the plan, and many of these are referenced in my witness statement, and also part of my witness statement included quite a detailed appendix, Appendix 3, which extracted various policies and sections of the policy framework, including the Part 1 plan. And there was a column that provided for the policies themselves, and then my opinion in relation to conformity, consistency. I won't go through that in any detail, but I just wanted you to know that these are also parts of that plan that are provided in that appendix. And so we know that the Part 1 plan sets out policies, both general functional policies that relate to all development in Richmond Hill and also relate to the development of secondary plans. And the Part 1 plan, I think, is of interest in relation to the secondary plan. I apologize, I'm just going to scroll down. I wanted to take you to Section 3. Trying to make this larger. What does this do? Nope. I apologize. There we go. Okay. And Section 3 of the City of Richmond Hill Parent Official Plan is important in that it relates to the general policies that speak to building a new kind of urban. And this is clearly the city's response in terms of providing a new plan in 2010 at the time to the new approach to I shouldn't say new approach, but to the the changes that had occurred in relation to bringing forward a growth plan for which they were required to conform to, and putting in place policies that direct the city in this direction for identifying intensification areas and policies related to complete communities. And the plan itself is interesting in that when describing this section, it's really speaking to the approach that the city has to growth and growth management. And so it's dealing with matters of urban structure and the framework for the town. How is the town going to grow and manage that growth through the planning horizon? And it's speaking specifically to the planning principles of complete communities and the importance of those. And within the plan, you will note going through it that similar to many official plans, there are sections that provide what I would refer to as narrative. They're describing the policies that are contained. They're describing some context. And then you have the actual policies themselves. And both are certainly important, but it's the policies themselves that are providing the direction for growth and growth management, especially in the section 3. And so if I can just scroll down. So in terms of building this new kind of community, you can see, Mr. Chairman, there's this introductory narrative that speaks to the importance of city building and also speaks to building this new kind of community has to recognize that it will not become urban overnight. And it talks about a balanced approach to urbanization that's reflected in this plan. And it goes on to talk about guiding principles and again relates back to complete communities, the environment, economy, placemaking, connectivity, and mobility. And those are many of the principles that we see that have been carried forward in the KDA secondary plan. This section provides guiding principles, for complete communities, and specifically directing growth to built up urban areas with existing infrastructure and services in a network of centers and corridors. And we know, again, Yonge Street as a major corridor and the KDA as one of the key development areas or centers. And this section also talks importantly to the planning horizon for the official plan, which is to 2031. And it also sets out as required the implementation of the forecasts as applied from the region's plan, as well as policies that are specific to intensification and intensification targets. And sorry, I jumped there, but you can see here that there is a target for residential intensification, the number of units that are to be provided, the minimum number of units to be provided between 2006 and 2031, and that is 15,300 units. In section 3.13, this is the section that relates to the urban structure framework for the city. And this is identifying, as you can see again in the column, these are very helpful in the plan. They provide some context to the text, the narrative, speaking about centers and corridors. And these policies are identifying that this urban structure framework was developed to reflect the physical makeup of the town over the long-term planning horizon, and also what it refers to as a visual synthesis of provincial and regional policy direction to growth management. And the city has taken this and it has in its urban structure identified that intensification and development, specifically intensification, growth through intensification, will be focused as is set out on Schedule A of the plan in centers and corridors. And we know that intensification will occur throughout the city, and there is a reference to all of the various areas that are identified for intensification, and specifically the level of intensification that is to occur. And that's very common for a municipality to have an intensification hierarchy where you're identifying various levels of intensification that are to occur and to be planned for. And this brings me to section 3.1.3 sub 3, which states that the majority of intensification in the town, now city, shall occur in the centers and corridors as shown on Schedule A1, urban structure, and defined by the land use designations on A2. Intensification outside of those areas shall be limited in accordance with the policies of the plan. So we know from this policy direction in the plan that the KDA, as part of the Yonge Street corridor and certainly identified as a key development area, is to provide for the majority of intensification, part of that majority of intensification within the city. We know the policies go on to state that the city's hierarchy of intensification is described in various policies in the plan, and the appropriate type, mix, scale, and intensity of development shall be provided based on the policies of the plan. We also know that those policies are before you to be considered for modification to allow the KDA secondary plan and the zoning bylaw to be implemented. And so the next policy here, which is 3.1.3 sub 5, is actually the first policy that is before you to be considered for proposed modification. And that is a policy that is subject to appeal, still subject to appeal from a previous appeal, but is consolidated before this panel.
And sorry, just before you go on, just for assistance, Mr. Chair, when you see a reference to Appellant 10, you'll see from page 563 that that is a reference to TSMJC. So anytime you see Appellant 10, it indicates that that's a policy that TSMJC has had under appeal as part of its Part 1 OP appeal dating back to 2011. And these are policies that are now being brought forward for the tribunal's approval as part of the settlement with TSMJC.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure
Yes.
that I agree with what Mr. Kussner has just advised, because I'm only aware of two specific policies that are under appeal by TSMJC that have been brought into this hearing, and that is related to the height and density in the KDA. So this one is not one of those policies, as I understand it. Sorry, I can't hear the chairs.
Haven't heard anything.
I wanted you to identify yourself, please, sir, because we
Oh.
can't see you.
I'm sorry, this is Jason Cherniak.
Cherniak.
So did you hear what I said, or should I repeat myself?
I heard what you said, but maybe I see others didn't. Go ahead.
So the policy that is on the screen right now may be or is under appeal by TSMJC, but it is not part of this hearing. The only policies in the Part 1 plan that are part of this hearing relate specifically to the heights and densities within the KDA.
So, Mr. Chair, as part of Council's endorsement of the secondary plan, you'll recall hearing earlier from Ms. Anderson that Council specifically endorsed a number of Part 1 official plan modifications as well. And those are the ones, if you refer to Exhibit 34, those are the ones listed under Section C, Section D, and Section E. The other ones that you see in Section A, Section B, Section F, and Section G, those are policies that TSMJC had under appeal as part of its Part 1 official plan appeal. And as a result of the proposed settlement, well, the settlement that has been reached between TSMJC and the city, a number of these policies, they are in effect withdrawing their appeal as it relates to those policies. So this is one example. They are accepting the policy as it was originally adopted by council without any further modification. So in my respectful submission, I would characterize that more as a withdrawal of the appeal, since there's no proposed modification. And to that extent, since TSMJC was the only party who had that policy remaining under appeal, in my submission, it's fully within this tribunal's purview to approve the policy as a de facto withdrawal of the appeal in relation to that policy.
So, Mr. Chair, I will admit I was not aware that that's where Mr. Kussner was going. I have no objection on that basis.
And Mr. Chair, it's Mr. Annabelle. That's my understanding as well, that by withdrawing TSMJC's appeals with respect to the outstanding Part 1 policies, that they would come into effect.
And I would point out, Mr. Chair, that that actually applies to all of the TSMJC initiated policies, A, B, F, and G. There are no further modifications contemplated, so it is a de facto withdrawal of the appeal in relation to all of those policies.
May I speak to this matter?
Quickly.
I would like to propose some minor wording changes to 3.1.35 before it is approved. The first thing I'd like to change is we have the word town in there, and I would assume that the city would want city in place of town. I think we've been I think the city has been doing that as we've been moving through trying to change the nomenclature from town to city.
Sir, I don't think that even needs to be stated. Let's move on.
That was my first one. I had a second. So I would propose that the policy really reads, development in the centers and corridors shall accommodate the highest densities and widest range of uses. I propose to add the words and housing options. So that it then reads, development in the centers and corridors shall accommodate the highest densities and widest range of uses, add and housing options within the city. Does anybody have an objection to that?
Well, we're not going to deal with that right at the moment. Let's hear her evidence with respect to all of this. And you can propose in your cross-examination if she accepts them, okay?
Excuse me, this side, Iskander, can I speak?
Yes.
I'm a party to that case, as Mr. Kussner, and I don't know if Mr. Annabelle knows, and I don't approve this. I don't approve this change. I don't approve the change to the official plan.
Well, okay, thank you very much. We'll deal with it in cross-examination.
No, I don't approve this deal.
We got you.
Understand you. We're going to go on with this witness, and you can say your part later.
You can do your cross-examination and try to establish it. Your suggestions through cross-examination. Okay.
Okay.
Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would note for the members that the acceptance of this policy, therefore, through the withdrawal of the appeal, puts in place the policy that now provides for the development in the centers and corridors shall accommodate the highest densities and the widest range of uses within the city, and shall be provided at an appropriate scale and intensity in accordance with the other policies of the plan. And that includes built form transitioning to the surrounding areas, ensuring the creation of a high quality human scale pedestrian oriented public realm. And Mr. Chairman, I would note that it's my opinion that through the KDA secondary plan and the implementing zoning bylaw, certainly there is conformity with this direction and this policy as it is provided. These policies then go on to speak to some of the elements within that hierarchy of intensification, including the Richmond Hill Center, which we know is the city's urban growth center. It then speaks to and this is 3.1.3 sub 8. Again, another policy that's under appeal by TSMJC, for which they are withdrawing their appeal and accepting this policy, which states that development applications to amend the official plan that would have the effect of reducing the density of a site that has been designed for medium or high density residential development in the centers and corridors shall only be considered through a municipal comprehensive review. And that's certainly an important policy to have in a parent plan for urban structure to ensure that we don't have what is often referred to as a down zoning within those areas. And if any significant change is to occur to reduce the amount of intensification, that should be considered through a municipal comprehensive review. And that's certainly not the case here. In fact, the converse, we're looking to enhance and increase the intensification in the KDA. The current official plan policy specific to key development areas is found in 3.1.39. And this states that key development areas, KDAs, will accommodate intensification within the town at a level less than Richmond Hill Center and are envisioned as mixed-use centers along a regional corridor. The existence of public rapid transit service combined with major existing nodes of retail and commercial development and opportunities for large land parcels to be redevelopment provide ideal conditions to promote transit-oriented development. We've certainly heard evidence in relation to that context of the large land parcels. We know that there is considerable investment and development in relation to transit for this area. We also know that currently the Richmond Hill Center Urban Growth Center is to provide in that hierarchy a level of intensification as is described here at the top. And there's been quite a number of issues that have been raised in relation to this hierarchy and how is it possible that the KDA, as it's proposed, could be provided when we know that the current policies related to the Richmond Hill Center, which are also the minimum 200 jobs and persons per hectare as per the growth plan requirements. How is it that the KDA can now have an intensification level that is greater than that? And I would provide to you my opinion in two respects. One is that the policy as it's set out in terms of the hierarchy is not static. And that is that there are levels of intensification that are provided through minimum density targets. And those are changing and evolving in response to provincial and regional policy. And in essence, this KDA is the first, I would say, out of the gate and ready to come across the finish line. And it's been done through a comprehensive planning process, which is now implementing the direction from the parent plan to provide for a level of intensification, transit supportive development in accordance with all the principles. And in coming forward, it does not preclude the ability to maintain that hierarchy as the Richmond Hill Center itself and the municipal comprehensive review process will address increases in intensification and development in accordance with all the changes that this KDA has addressed to maintain that level of intensification hierarchy. And it's my opinion that it would in fact not be appropriate to preclude a comprehensive planning process with the resulting implementation to provide for the Yonge and Bernard KDA, to put that on hold and not allow that to go forward until all of those other elements are studied and reviewed and updated in accordance with the plan. And so I think it's important to note that, again, these matters are not static. I mean, we've seen several policies that certainly will require some revision and update with a comprehensive review. And in that context, I believe it's important not to be prescriptive, so to limit the opportunity to implement a part of the requirement of this parent plan when there are evolving provincial policies and requirements and investment in transit that necessitate the approval of the proposed modifications for this particular secondary plan. Briefly then, I would like to turn, Mr. Chairman, to, my apologies. I believe it's section 3.1.4. And this section is speaking to the integration of land uses. This is speaking to the principles of complete community, balancing housing types, employment, amenities, services, parks, and urban open space. Integrating all of those with supportive infrastructure, including public transit. And again, along what's referred to as a continuum ranging from a broad range of uses in the centers and corridors to more of a limited range of uses within neighborhoods or specified employment lands, where you would have more of a collection of a similar type of use. These policies go on to talk about the policy of council related to the mix of uses, and also speak specifically to a mix of uses that are directed to centers and corridors in order to fulfill these various objectives. And you will note, sorry, in this section 3.1.4 sub 3, as is highlighted, again, this is a policy that's subject to appeal by TSMJC, for which they are now accepting the policy and withdrawing their appeal. And that policy speaks to within the centers and corridors, the greatest mix and range of uses and the highest densities shall be directed to major public transit terminals and stations. And we certainly know that that is reflective of the KDA in terms of the secondary plan before you as modified, providing for that full mix and range of uses based on the way the policies have been formulated and how they will be implemented through the zoning bylaw to ensure that there is a balance between residential and non-residential uses. And certainly that the KDA policies provide for the support in relation to the transit station itself and the station area. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn now to the Part 1 policies in Section 4. I can just bring these up. It may take a few. I know there is a faster way to do this, so my apologies. Mr. Chairman, these are policies in the Part 1 plan that relate to land use. And so they set out a series of policies in relation to various types of land uses that are found in the designations and throughout the plan. And specifically, these policies actually include policies that relate again to the Richmond Hill Center as the urban growth center, and also to the key development areas. And those policies are found in section 4.4. And Mr. Chairman, these policies that relate to the key development areas, about halfway or a third of the way through this narrative section, they talk about the key development areas are intensification areas, and again, located on a regional corridor, and in the Yonge Bernard case along Yonge Street, where public rapid transit service intersect with major nodes of retail and commercial development activity, and there are opportunities that exist for redevelopment of large sites that can support new public streets, parks, and urban open space connections. We see the reference here to 2 KDAs that have been designated on Yonge Street, one at the intersection of Yonge Street and Carville and 16th Avenue, often called the Yonge and 16th KDA, the other at Yonge Street and Bernard, and that is the subject of the secondary plan and zoning before you. And those KDAs are envisioned as sub-centers, intermodal nodes between the local and the regional center. Again, going back to that idea of the urban structure. Whoops, my apologies. The last section here is that the Yonge Street and Bernard KDA will be a sub-center for mixed-use, high-density development due to its proximity to public rapid transit on Yonge Street, including the Bernard Transit Terminal and the opportunity to intensify underutilized lands in the area. So certainly there's key direction here for the Yonge and Bernard KDA to be developed with, again, that intensification of underutilized land. This section goes on to state, in terms of some of the objectives, that it is the policy of council that the town shall prepare a secondary plan for both of these KDAs in accordance with the policies of section 5.1 of the plan. And I will get to that a little bit later in terms of going through those requirements of the Part 1 plan for the development of a secondary plan. I believe you have heard some evidence on that. You see that there in the parent plan are a list of land uses that are to be permitted, that shall be permitted within the KDA designation. It ranges from medium density to high density, office, major office, commercial, retail, community uses, parks, and live-work units, all in accordance with other sections of the plan as well. It goes on to talk about the long-term objective of the plan, that the intensification of these major retail uses occur through redevelopment in a more compact urban form. It then speaks to development fronting on Yonge and 16th Avenue and Bernard Avenue shall be required to provide commercial, retail, or community uses at grade in a mixed-use building format. And we certainly see in the policies that have been outlined, and Mr. Theodore spoke to these, there is a requirement in terms of policies to implement active uses at grade in accordance with the schedules of the plan that require that 15% of active at grade uses along those locations in conformity with the official plan. The next 2 policies, which for reference are in this section 4.4.16 and 7, are policies that are before you in terms of consideration and in terms of further modifications. And if I turn to Exhibit 34, and specifically under Section C, as Mr. Kustner referred to, you will see that these policies have been proposed to be modified in 2 ways. Certainly the modification to Section 6, which in my review is intended to relate to both of the KDAs. The intention here in Section 6, as it currently reads, is that the density of a development block within a KDA shall be a minimum of 2.5 FSI and a maximum of 3 FSI, and the boundaries of development blocks shall be identified in a secondary plan. And Exhibit 34 provides for modifications to Policy 6 and divides it into 2 policies. The first of which, under A, maintains the idea of the density of a development block shall be a minimum of 2.5 FSI and a maximum of 3 FSI, but it adds a modification, which in my opinion is appropriate to reflect not only the current modifications before you for the Yonge and Bernard KDA, but any future policies that may become before you in terms of a secondary plan for the Yonge and 16th. And that is to provide for the overall minimum and maximum FSI for specific blocks within a KDA, or for a KDA overall, may be revised through the development and the approval of a secondary plan for that KDA. It then goes on to maintain that the boundaries of development blocks shall be identified in a secondary plan. And the importance of this modification is to provide the ability for the parent plan to allow the secondary plan process and its comprehensive process that may result in policies and direction for that KDA that are formulated to have flexibility to allow for modifications and changes that provide for an overall minimum and maximum in any one particular block of the KDA or the overall KDA as justified through that secondary plan process. And I believe this modification is appropriate in two ways. One is that it allows for the implementation of the proposed KDA before you, which, as we will see in section B, specifically relates to Yonge and Bernard. And we may in the future see a section C proposed modification before you for Yonge and 16th. But certainly it allows for the implementation of that second part, which I'll speak to in a moment. But it also allows that flexibility within the secondary plan process to look at alternatives, not only within the development blocks, the quadrants of a particular KDA, and also that can apply to future KDAs that may be identified through the municipal comprehensive review, which I think is an important consideration in looking at this modification. The second part of this modification is specific to the implementation of the Yonge and Bernard KDA secondary plan, and that is to reflect the comprehensive work that has been done to provide for the minimum 2.5 FSI and maximum FSI overall, and also identifying that the allocation of density within that KDA shall be specified in a schedule to the official plan and implementing zoning bylaw, in this case, a secondary plan, the implementing zoning bylaw, and that these allocations on a parcel by parcel basis can be less than or greater than the prescribed overall density. And this assists in implementing the KDA. As we know, we have the corridor designation with the allocation in the schedule of up to 5 FSI, and we see that lower to 3 in the interior areas. But this policy, in terms of amending the parent plan, is allowing the implementation of that secondary plan with that flexibility and with the intent of maintaining the overall maximum of 4 FSI. And it's my opinion, Mr. Chairman, that those modifications to these sections of the parent plan are appropriate and are justified in terms of achieving the requirements from the provincial-led policy system and providing conformity with provincial and regional policy directions in terms of the transit supportive intensification that can be provided within the Yonge and Bernard Key Development Area Secondary Plan and its implementing zoning bylaw. Mr. Chairman, there are 2 further policies that I will speak to, and that is the next policy, which is 4.4.1.7. And this policy is in reference to development that may occur prior to the approval of a secondary plan for a KDA. And that is a requirement to provide for a concept plan that has to be submitted in accordance with section 5.2 of the plan. And that concept plan is required to demonstrate how the development meets the land use and design policies of this plan for areas identified as a development block by the city. And the reference that you have in Exhibit 34 to this modification maintains the majority of the language in this section, save and except the last added further modification, which states identified as a development block by the town within the Yonge Street and 16th Avenue KDA. As we know, the reference there previously is to development blocks. But we know for the Yonge and Bernard KDA that we've specified quadrants, and we speak to quadrants. And so the reference here is to tie that link and for the quadrant which contains the development lands within the Yonge Street and Bernard KDA. And that modification, in my opinion, again, is appropriate and justified in that this policy will now read, as it's to be modified, that if I am to come forward before this panel finalizes its disposition on these matters, that I would be required to come forward with a concept plan within the Yonge and Bernard KDA that addresses section 5.2 for the quadrant within which my redevelopment sits. And so I think that clarification is important in that it is requiring, as we have seen others who have brought forward applications, providing for that concept plan that would address those items in section 5.2. And just for your reference, Mr. Chairman, section 5.2 is specifically a section in the parent one plan that relates to what are referred to as tertiary plans or concept plans. So it has a list of requirements that would be applied to that particular plan that would have to be brought forward. So again, it's my opinion that that proposed further modification to section 441 sub 7 is appropriate and justified, again, to facilitate the implementation of the KDA secondary plan and make reference to any application that comes forward to have those requirements for that particular quadrant. Mr. Chairman, you will note that the next section, subsection 8, provides for specific height requirements for the Yonge Street and 16th Avenue KDA. And you'll see a series of requirements for both minimum and maximum heights, and also reference to the tallest buildings being directed towards the intersection. And then a policy which is 4.4.1 sub 9. And this is the policy that is specific to the Yonge and Bernard KDA. And this is the policy for which the proposed modifications are, again, to reflect the proposed KDA secondary plan. And again, that is to maintain the minimum building height of 3 stories, the maximum base building height of 6 stories, and the maximum building height with the modified wording shall be determined through a policy-led framework that includes the application of allocated site densities and angular plane policies among other specific sites within the KDA. And finally, maintaining that the tallest buildings should be directed, I would add to maintain the word directed, towards the intersection of Yonge Street and Bernard Avenue and along Yonge Street in general. So if I could, Madam Chair, just for grammar, add the word directed. And Mr. Chairman, this modification is specifically required to reflect the work that has culminated in the proposed KDA secondary plan and to reflect the requirements that will apply to the Yonge and Bernard KDA in terms of height and, as we know, the deployment of density as the policy to provide for the level of intensification. And for those reasons, this modification, again, in my opinion, is appropriate and justified to reflect the implementation of the proposed secondary plan and implementing zoning bylaw. Mr. Chairman, there is one final policy that is reflected in Exhibit 34. And again, this is a policy for which there was an appeal that is to be withdrawn. And this relates to Section 5.7. And these, I believe, were policies in the implementation section that reference the make sure I haven't gone by this. Back to those. It's the section in 5.7. My apologies. Specific to holding provision bylaws. Certainly a requirement to have these policies within a parent plan to enable them to be provided in implementing zoning bylaws. And you will see this section under 5.7 sub 2 was subject to an appeal. And I won't read through all of this other than to say that the holding bylaw passed under Section 36 may be used in order to implement the plan for one or more of the following purposes. And this goes on to list the various requirements that can be put in place for conditions, for phasing of development, mitigation, impact measures, measures related to heritage. Again, this relates to community benefits and to ensure legal agreements are in place through various mechanisms. And it's my understanding that through the withdrawal of this policy, it again enables the holding provision as is provided in both the policies and the zoning bylaw to be considered as part of the proposed modifications by the members. And I would note that I know there are still matters in relation to both the policies that speak to the holding provisions and the provisions themselves that I believe are still deferred to phase 2. So in terms of the phase 1 policy that allows the use and the implementation through Section 36, that is, I believe, the appeal or the withdrawal of this appeal is allowing that to be considered. The nature and the content of what is in the secondary plan and in the zoning bylaw, certain parts of the policies in the secondary plan and the zoning bylaw as it relates at least to the TSMJC site is to be deferred to phase 2 of this hearing. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I just wanted to touch upon some of the issues that were raised in relation to the Part 1 proposed policy amendments. And I believe this relates to issues 1 through 4 from Mr. Cherniak's client, the YRA. And I believe the issue as it related to the TSMJC has now been resolved. But just speaking to the issues 1 through 4, and I'll just briefly reiterate those. The issue raised in relation to the Richmond Hill Part 1 plan relates to these proposed modifications. And as it's phrased, it asks the question, is it appropriate for the Richmond Hill Official Plan Part 1 to include a higher FSI for the Yonge and Bernard KDA than for that in the Yonge and 16th KDA? And in response to that particular issue, as I noted, it is my opinion that it is appropriate to provide for the proposed modifications to include the current proposed FSI overall of 4 for the Yonge and Bernard KDA, then is what is provided to the Yonge and 16th KDA, given the current policy context. And as I mentioned, there's a comprehensive planning process that has been undertaken by the city, and the resulting formulated policies and modifications that are proposed justify utilizing a minimum and maximum FSI for the Yonge and Bernard KDA to implement the plan. And that same comprehensive process remains to be undertaken for the Yonge and 16th Avenue KDA. And it would be through that process, in my opinion, that, given its context and given the policy framework, appropriate densities for that KDA will be likewise addressed and developed and proposed to council. And as noted, the densities in the KDA respond to, in the Yonge and Bernard KDA, respond to that current and evolving provincial and regional policy requirement to implement the required minimum density targets and respond to that policy framework accordingly. And I would note that in my discussions with city staff to understand the status of the Yonge and 16th KDA is that they have been working on that secondary plan and an implementing zoning bylaw and presented that information to council in 2018. And council has directed them to continue with that process, to continue to speak with and consult with stakeholders. And then with the initiation of, we have that KDA occurring, we have this KDA that's been completed. The city is also updating its own official plan, the Part 1 official plan, as we speak, and initiated that in November of last year. And certainly had indicated that they would continue that process. And as you know, with the Regents MCR also underway and somewhat paused, these are all sort of moving processes, some of which inform and require implementation by others. And so it's through that we know that the finalization of some of the more detailed planning in the Yonge and 16th KDA, again, similar to the Yonge and Bernard KDA, will be informed and will implement the provincial and regional policies. And so while I agree it's appropriate in an official plan to have an understanding of urban structure in relation to a hierarchy, it cannot be so prescriptive so as to limit an opportunity for intensification that would conform to and achieve the provincial policy directions, especially as it relates to significant transit investment and infrastructure investment. And it's my opinion that the KDAs and the Urban Growth Center, the Richmond Hill Center, can coexist within this evolving policy regime. And that means that some areas may be updated and implemented prior to others. And I believe that's appropriate, because to place the Yonge and Bernard KDA on hold until the other areas are reviewed, given the extensive planning, the technical work, the consultation that has taken place, is not appropriate and would not does not constitute a non-conformity with the intent of the Part 1 policies. They can coexist, they can be independently studied, and they can be independently implemented through the secondary plan process. The other issue, Mr. Chairman, that's somewhat related to the Part 1 policies from the YRA is, I believe it's their issue number 4, issue number 2, and This goes to what is the appropriate maximum density in the KDA, and it speaks to overall and on a site-by-site basis. And some of my evidence as I go through the secondary plan itself will speak to this, but it's my opinion that it is appropriate overall to have a maximum density in this KDA of up to 4 FSI. And again, that's provided that the modification to the Part 1 plan is in place. And on a site-by-site basis, based again on those policies, I also think it's appropriate for the density to be determined that can be greater than or less than, so long as that overall is being achieved. And we know through schedules 1 through 4 that all other applicable policies of the secondary plan will apply in considering the appropriate density with any particular area of the KDA. And those policies relate to the appropriate built form. And those policies also provide for the implementation of the regional and the policy framework, which all lead to consistency with good planning. And I believe there was one last issue that spoke to whether or not assumptions around calculating GFA and FSI are correct. And it's not clear to me in responding to this issue exactly what that is in reference to, but what I would say is that the way the policies are provided for, especially given that there is reference to FSI in these parent policies, that those definitions are clearly provided for in both the parent plan and the secondary plan. Section 7 of the parent plan and specifically 12.2.3 in the KDA plan. And those definitions provide that guidance and direction in terms of calculating FSI in relation to development that's proposed. And my apologies, there is one last issue that relates to the KDA and definitely relates to how the intensification is framed in the Part 1 plan. And this is a question of whether the total number of residential units in the KDA shall be limited. And if so, what is the appropriate maximum? And it's my opinion that that should not be implemented through the KDA, nor should it be implemented in the Part 1 plan. We know that the provincial, the regional policy framework that is to be implemented requires a minimum density target to be provided, and that is to address the forecast for both population and employment, and certainly the minimum targets and requirements for both intensification and intensification within a major transit station area. And any overall cap on a maximum is not among the policy tools in the higher order policy documents that would be appropriate to implement in the secondary plan. And I believe, in my opinion, such an approach is also overly prescriptive and contrary to the direction to be responsive to providing a supply of market housing.
Providing a supply of what? I didn't catch that.
Housing in the market.
Oh. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, does that now complete your analysis and opinions respecting the Part 1 official plan?
Yes, Mr. Kustner, based on the proposed policies to the Part 1 plan and the further modifications as provided in Exhibit 34, that concludes my evidence, other than to say that, in my opinion, those proposed modifications are appropriate. And I will speak to overall all the proposed modifications in terms of consistency with the provincial policy statement, conformity with the growth plan, and the other provincial and regional policies. It's my opinion that those proposed modifications are appropriate and represent good planning.
Thank you. If I could then ask you to turn to your analysis and opinions with respect to the proposed KDA secondary plan.
I suggest we have a 10-minute break.